The desert night in Arizona whispers secrets to those who know how to listen, not in windswept sand, but in the slow groan of continental plates, in the faint hum of ancient atoms. Dr. Evelyn Reed, her fingers tracing data on a cold screen, often felt a profound, almost sorrowful resonance with this deep time. She understood the eons, the patient unfolding of life, the slow waltz of ice ages and warming trends. But then, a flicker in the data, a chilling anomaly, not a gradual shift, not a slow decline, but a rupture so violent, so impossibly swift, it defied the very language of geology. A vibrant, sun-drenched world, teeming with life that breathed for millions of years, held its last breath. Then, in just 4 hours, 250 million years ago, it froze. Not merely chilled, but stopped. A planet-wide gasp, leaving nothing but a frozen echo in the bedrock. The question wasn't how, but why such a swift, silent death? Ici quiet hum of deep time. The desert night in Arizona, vast and ink black, pressed against the domed roof of the observatory. It was a silence unlike any other, not merely the absence of sound, but a profound, ancient quiet, punctuated only by the low thrum of the cooling systems and the distant, almost imperceptible groan of the continental plates beneath. Dr. Evelyn Reed, perched on a worn swivel chair, felt this quiet deep in her bones. It was the whisper of eons, the patient breath of a planet that had seen more sunsets than any human mind could fathom. Her fingers, slender and precise, moved across a holographic display that shimmered with the chaotic beauty of geological time. Lines of data, like arteries of a long-dead leviathan, traced the Earth's climatic heartbeat over hundreds of millions of years. Evelyn, a paleoclimatologist whose life was dedicated to deciphering these ancient languages, had always found a peculiar, almost mournful resonance with the planet's deep past. She didn't just study it, she felt it. The colossal shifts, the slow-motion ballads of ice and fire, the triumphs of life, the devastating, silent extinctions. They all echoed within her, a symphony of rise and fall. Her workspace was a cocoon of muted light and focused intention. A half-empty mug of herbal tea steamed beside her keyboard, its warmth a small, temporary anchor against the chill of the air-conditioned room. Books on petrology, paleontology, and astrophysics lay stacked in precarious towers, their pages dog-eared and annotated with her meticulous script. Beyond the curved window, a sliver of the Milky Way, a faint, milky band of stars, stretched across the void. A timeless backdrop to her very human endeavor to comprehend time itself. She was tracing a particularly intricate period, the late Permian. It was a time of immense biodiversity, a world teeming with life before the Permian Triassic extinction event, the Great Dying, which had wiped out over 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Evelyn knew the accepted narrative: a gradual buildup of volcanic activity, massive carbon dioxide emissions, ocean acidification, a slow, agonizing suffocation of life. It was a tragedy of immense scale, but one that unfolded over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. The Earth, in its monumental patience, suffered and then, eventually, healed. But tonight, something was different. A subtle tremor, a discordant note in the grand symphony of the past, began to register. She had been analyzing isotope ratios from ancient rock samples, meticulously cross-referencing them with sedimentary layers, ice cores, where available from later periods, to refine her models and fossil records. The data sets were vast, sprawling networks of information gathered from expeditions across the globe. She zoomed in, then out, scrolling through time with a practiced fluidity. For days, she'd felt a prickle of unease, an intuitive nudge that something was amiss. It wasn't a sudden spike, not a glaring error. It was more insidious. A series of minute deviations, almost imperceptible, that collectively formed a whisper of anomaly. It began with the oxygen isotopes. Their ratios, usually a reliable barometer of ancient temperatures and precipitation, showed a series of readings that were just off. Not wildly so, but enough to create a faint, unsettling ripple in her otherwise smooth climate models. Then the carbon isotopes, hinting at fluctuations in the global carbon cycle that didn't quite align with known volcanic pulses or orbital shifts. And finally, the faintest ghost of a signal in the magnetic mineral alignments within a newly analyzed set of core samples from Western Australia, hinting at a geologically impossible rapidity of environmental change. It was like hearing a familiar song played on an instrument slightly out of tune. Each individual note sounded almost right, but the harmony was subtly, profoundly distorted. This anomaly, this barely there deviation, suggested a speed of environmental change that defied the very principles of geological gradualism she had studied for decades. It was a rupture, not a ripple. A sudden violent tear in the fabric of deep time. A moment when the slow, patient breath of the planet seemed to catch, to convulse. A profound melancholy settled over her, heavy as the desert dust. It wasn't just the professional curiosity of a scientist confronting an unexplained phenomenon. It was deeper, more personal. Evelyn felt as if she were peering through a veil into a forgotten past. A moment of such raw, unmitigated planetary pain that it resonated across the eons. The data wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was a faint echo of a vibrant, living world now lost to the ages. She saw, in her mind's eye, a sun-drenched landscape, teeming with strange, ancient life, unaware of the impending, impossible swiftness of its demise. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, colder than the desert night. The scientific mind sought explanation, but the human heart sought understanding, and, perhaps, sorrow. To glimpse such a profound, forgotten tragedy, even through the cold lens of data, stirred a deep, aching sadness within her. It was a lament for a world that held its last breath. A silent scream, frozen in the bedrock. The anomaly was a ghost, and Evelyn Reed, alone in the quiet heart of the Arizona desert, felt its cold presence. It was a prelude, she sensed, to something far grander and far more terrifying than any extinction event she had ever dared to imagine. She leaned closer to the screen, her breath fogging the cool glass, her fingers hovering over the data, as if she could reach through the digital veil and touch the frozen echo of a world that died too fast. A cold breath from the Permian. The cool hum of the server room was a familiar lullaby to Dr. Evelyn Reed. Beyond the reinforced walls of the climate-controlled lab, the Arizona desert slept, a vast expanse of rust-colored stone and skeletal saguaros. Each silent vigil a testament to unimaginable stretches of time. Evelyn preferred the quiet hours of pre-dawn, when the world outside was still muted, and the data on her screens could speak without interruption. Her current obsession lay not in the digital whispers of satellite imagery or recent geological surveys, but in a physical manifestation of Earth's deepest memories, a section of core sample, meticulously labeled and cradled in its sterile container. It had come from a collaborative deep drilling project in the remote, ancient cratons of the North American continent, a place where the planet's very foundations remained largely undisturbed. This particular segment, dark and dense, with layers of shale and ancient limestone, held within its petrified heart a story that was slowly, painfully coming to light. She had been running a battery of microspectroscopy tests, searching for anomalies in isotopic ratios, for trace elements that spoke of ancient atmospheric conditions, for the faintest fossilized whispers of microbial life. The initial scans had been unremarkable, a gentle curve of typical Permian sedimentation, a predictable progression of eon sky. But then, a subtle deviation had registered, a spike in an otherwise placid dataset. Evelyn, with the patience of a paleontologist sifting through dust for bone fragments, had homed in. It wasn't a gradual shift, like the onset of a typical ice age, where carbon dioxide levels dipped slowly over millennia, or volcanic ash layers built up over centuries. This was different. The initial readings, deep within the sample, showed a rich, vibrant world, a symphony of life, complex and thriving, reflected in the intricate organic compounds and stable oxygen isotopes. It spoke of warm, shallow seas, lush coastal forests, and a sun that beat down with predictable generosity. Then, in a layer barely thicker than a human fingernail, the data screamed. What Evelyn saw was a brutal discontinuity. The chemical signatures of life, so abundant just micrometers below, abruptly vanished. The isotopic ratios of oxygen, typically varying with temperature and atmospheric composition, didn't just shift, they snapped. They indicated an instantaneous plunge to temperatures utterly incompatible with liquid water, let alone complex organic life. It wasn't merely cold. It was the kind of cold that shattered molecular bonds, the kind of cold that hinted at an atmosphere that had literally frozen solid. Her fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she reran the analysis, then again, then a third time, consulting cross-referencing datasets from other international core samples gathered from the same geological epoch. Each repetition confirmed the impossible. The data pointed to a climatic shift so rapid, so absolute, that the very instruments struggled to register it. Conventional geological models, which accounted for events like supervolcano eruptions or asteroid impacts, still operated on timescales of years, decades, even centuries for truly planetary scale changes. This was orders of magnitude faster. She leaned closer to the screen, her breath ghosting over the cool glass, tracing the precipitous drop in the graph, the line falling like a stone off a cliff. Each data point represented an infinitesimally small slice of time, calibrated with absolute precision. And when she extrapolated the rate of change, factoring in the deposition rates and known radioactive decay markers that anchored the timeline, the answer returned, chilling her to the bone. 4 hours. 4 hours. The entire span of a short working day. Enough time for a slow-brewed coffee, a brief meeting, a drive across the city. Yet, 250 million years ago, in that unimaginably brief window, an entire planet had gasped its last breath, plunging from verdant warmth to unimaginable, instant stasis. It defied every known principle of atmospheric physics, every gradual ebb and flow that defined Earth's long, patient history. It wasn't a decline, it was an amputation. A vibrant world, teeming with species that had adapted and evolved over millions of years, had been snuffed out in less time than it took for the sun to cross a quarter of the sky. A profound sorrow settled over Evelyn, a quiet, heavy cloak. It wasn't just the professional shock of an unprecedented discovery. It was the echo of an immense, silent tragedy. She had spent her life listening to the Earth's long, slow stories, the whispers of deep time. But this was a shriek, frozen solid, leaving only the ghost of a question. How could the planet, so robust, so resilient, fall so utterly and completely, so swiftly, into a sleep from which it took millions of years to truly awaken? The data offered no explanation, only the brutal, undeniable truth of the event. It was a wound in the planet's narrative, a missing page in the grand story of life, and the emptiness it left behind resonated with an almost unbearable grief. The world had simply stopped, and Evelyn, alone in the quiet hum of the lab, could only stare at the cold numbers and wonder, with a heart heavy as ancient stone, what silent horror could unfold with such impossible speed. Oh, the sun-drenched world that was. The cold glow of the data screen in Dr. Evelyn Reed's Arizona lab was a stark contrast to the vibrant world she was trying to resurrect. The desert night pressed against the windows, a velvet quiet, broken only by the hum of servers, a sound that sometimes, in the deepest hours, felt like the distant thrum of the earth itself. The anomaly, that 4-hour rupture, had become more than just a scientific puzzle. It was a haunting, a phantom limb of ancient trauma that Evelyn felt increasingly connected to. She had fallen into the late Permian, not merely studying it, but living it, piece by agonizing piece. Her immersion was total. Days bled into nights, marked by the gradual shift from the austere desert palette outside to the imagined greens and bronzes of a world 250 million years gone. She pored over paleobotanical reconstructions, her fingers tracing the imagined veins of giant Glossopteris leaves, large enough to shelter a small creature. She analyzed the isotopic signatures embedded in rock samples, whispers of atmospheric composition, a denser, warmer air, richer in carbon dioxide than today, fueling an explosion of life. Fossil records, meticulously catalogued from dig sites across what was then the supercontinent of Pangaea, were not just specimens, but the silent portraits of a lost Eden. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the abstract data coalesce into a vivid, breathing landscape. She pictured the Permian sun, a broad gold orb hanging in a sky that might have been a deeper blue, or perhaps a hazy emerald, tinted by the ancient atmosphere. Beneath it, not the sparse, spiky plants of her desert home, but an overwhelming verdant tapestry. Towering ferns, some reaching 30-40 feet high, formed dense, dark canopies that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns on the forest floor. They were true giants, their fronds unfurling in slow, elegant spirals, contributing to an almost suffocating humidity that clung to the air, thick with the scent of damp earth and verdant decay. Colossal club mosses, their scaled trunks like ancient reptilian skin, stood sentinel, their spores scattering like fine golden dust in the slightest breeze. Cycads, primitive conifers, and the unique glossopterids, trees that formed vast, swampy forests, created an unbroken expanse of green that stretched to distant, hazy horizons. This wasn't a world of struggling life, but one of boundless, unconstrained growth, where biomass seemed to pulse with an almost overwhelming energy. And within this verdant cathedral, life thrived. Evelyn saw them in her mind's eye, the creatures that called this world home. Not yet the titans of the Mesozoic, but formidable in their own right. She pictured the slow, deliberate lumber of a Hyperiosaurus, a herbivorous reptile with its heavily armored skin, browsing on low-lying cycads, its wide, placid eyes blinking slowly. In the murkier waters of a swampy delta, she imagined the ripple created by a lurking Gyrops, a massive amphibian, its broad head breaking the surface, patiently waiting for prey. Higher up the food chain, the egg gorgonopsians, saber-toothed synapsids, distant cousins to mammals, moved with a predatory grace, their powerful limbs carrying them through the undergrowth, senses sharp, ready to pounce on an unsuspecting dicynodont. Even the insects were immense. Dragonflies with wingspans of 2 feet, scuttling millipedes the length of an arm, their chitinous bodies glistening in the filtered light. The sounds, though silent to her modern ears, resonated in her imagination. The rustle of giant leaves in a warm breeze, the splash of a creature entering water, the guttural roar of a predator, the faint chirps and hums of insect life. It was a symphony of existence, complex and self-sustaining, honed over millions of years of evolution. A world so utterly alive, so profoundly enthering. And this profound there-ness was what made the impending doom a cold, visceral ache in Evelyn's chest. To imagine such vibrant ancient forests, so rich with the breath of countless creatures, so full of the patient rhythm of growth and decay, only to know that in 4 hours it ceased. Not faded, not declined over millennia, but simply stopped. The towering ferns froze mid-sway. The foraging creatures paused, mid-chew, mid-stride. Their last breath, forever suspended. It wasn't just an extinction. It was an amputation, a sudden, violent severing of life from time. She thought of the Adidimetrodons, those sail-backed synapsids, their bodies designed to bask in the Permian warmth, their sails acting as solar panels. What did they feel in those 4 hours? A sudden, inexplicable chill. A creeping paralysis? Did they look up at the familiar sun, now a cold alien disk, and understand in some primitive way that their world was ending? The sheer, almost unimaginable speed of it was what truly haunted her. The billions of individual heartbeats, the slow dance of photosynthesis, the intricate web of predator and prey, all extinguished in less time than it took for the sun to set. A profound sorrow settled over Evelyn, heavy and still as the ancient bedrock. It was a sorrow not just for the extinct species, but for the very process of life that was so brutally interrupted. A lament for a world that never knew what hit it, for a planet that had thrived so long, only to be silenced with an unthinkable swiftness. Her work was no longer just about geology or paleontology. It was an elegy, a quiet, whispered mourning for a lost world, and a desperate search for the why behind its sudden, tragic end. The Permian, once a distant epoch in a textbook, now felt like a personal tragedy she was compelled to witness, to understand, and perhaps to finally, gently, lay to rest. Yes, the shadow of the traps. The whisper Evelyn heard in the data, that sorrowful resonance with deep time, was not merely an echo of a cataclysm. It was the prolonged, agonizing gasp that preceded it. A cosmic sigh stretching across millennia. To understand the 4 hours of impossible ice, one had to first witness the slow creep of the inevitable. The agonizing unraveling that began not with a bang, but with a persistent, almost imperceptible tremor, deep within the Earth's ancient heart. Before the snap freeze, before the final, unimaginable silence, there was the long twilight. Millions of years before the Permian world drew its last breath, the first cracks appeared. Not fissures in the land, not yet, but in the very fabric of balance that had cradled life for eons. Far to the north, in what would one day become the vast frozen plains of Siberia, the earth itself began to bleed. Not in a single cataclysmic burst, but with a vast, patient malevolence. It began subtly, as all great tragedies often do. A faint haze in the morning sky, perhaps, noticed by no creature. A gentle, almost imperceptible warming trend that might have felt like a blessing after a long winter, extending the growing seasons, encouraging a brief, fertile bloom. But the warmth was deceptive, laced with a growing toxicity. Deep below the nascent continent, the mantle plumes, restless for ages, found their release. Not in explosive volcanoes that tore the sky, but in flood basalts, vast sheets of molten rock that welled up from endless fissures, spreading across the land like a slow, burning tide. Imagine the scale. Not mountains spewing fire, but an entire region becoming a slow-motion furnace. For hundreds of thousands, then millions of years, the earth groaned. Lava, thick and dark, flowed ceaselessly, burying landscapes, forming layers miles deep. Each flow released unimaginable quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and methane into the atmosphere. The very air began to change, growing heavy, sluggish, a blanket of invisible poison settling over the planet. The first casualties were silent, unnoticed. Microbes in the soil, sensitive to the subtle shifts in acidity, withered. Then the plants, their stomata struggling to breathe the altered air, their roots finding the ground too warm, too saturated with strange minerals. Forests, once vibrant tapestries of fern and conifer, began to thin, their leaves yellowing, their branches brittle. The great Glossopteris forests, which had dominated the southern supercontinent of Gondwana, began their slow, mournful retreat. Their seeds, once scattered generously by the wind, now found no purchase in the increasingly harsh soil. The subtle warming intensified, turning temperate zones into oppressive hothouses. Rain, when it fell, was not cleansing but corrosive, a weak acid that stung the leaves and tainted the freshwater lakes. Rivers, once crystal clear, grew cloudy with sediment, their banks lined with the ghostly silhouettes of dying flora. Fish, their gills struggling to extract oxygen from the increasingly warm and stagnant waters, began to surface, gasping, their scales dull, their movements listless. The great, sprawling deltas, once nurseries of life, became quiet graveyards. This wasn't an apocalypse announced by thunderclaps and firestorms across the sky. It was far more insidious, a creeping dread that settled over the world like a pervasive, debilitating illness. Creatures, from the smallest insect to the mighty amphibians and reptiles that roamed the land, found their habitats shrinking, their food sources dwindling, their very physiology stressed to its limits. The mighty Gorgonopsians, with their saber teeth, found their prey leaner, scarcer. The majestic Periosaurs, heavy-bodied herbivores, wandered through increasingly barren landscapes, their bellies empty. In the oceans, the catastrophe unfolded with an even more terrifying slowness. The colossal influx of CO2 into the atmosphere didn't just warm the air, it dissolved into the vast ancient sea. The oceans began to acidify, slowly but inexorably, stripping away the calcium carbonate that formed the shells of marine invertebrates, the skeletons of corals, the very scaffolding of marine ecosystems. Reefs, once vibrant cities of life, turned ghostly white, their inhabitants dissolving, their intricate structures crumbling into sediment. Plankton, the very foundation of the marine food web, dwindled. Then came the anoxia. As the oceans warmed, the circulation currents that distributed oxygen through their depths began to slow, then stall. Vast swathes of the deep sea became oxygen depleted, turning toxic. The very water suffocated its inhabitants. Ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and other deadly compounds began to leach from the decaying organic matter on the seafloor, bubbling up to taint even the shallower waters. The pungent, metallic smell of decay, faint at first, grew pervasive, carried on the oceanic breezes. Life, resilient beyond measure, fought back. Species adapted, migrated, struggled to find new niches. But the scale of the changes was too vast, the force too relentless. It was an unseen enemy, a fundamental shift in the planet's very chemistry, incomprehensible to the life forms that were its victims. There was no predator to flee, no competitor to outwit, no new land to conquer that wasn't equally afflicted. Just the slow, inexorable tightening of a planetary noose. The Permian world was not healthy when the final blow struck. It was a world already sick, its biodiversity shattered, its ecosystems teetering on the brink of collapse. The vibrant tapestry had frayed into fragile threads, the rich symphony of life reduced to a mournful, dying hum. The air was heavy, the ocean sour, the land barren. The stage was set, not for a natural conclusion, but for a rupture so profound, so utterly swift, that even the planet itself might have screamed, if a world could scream. What happened next, the 4 hours of impossible ice, was not merely a final act, but an unnatural intervention, a chilling anomaly that still whispered its unanswered questions across the vastness of time. When the world held its breath, the desert night in Arizona offered Evelyn Reed no escape from the chill she felt deep in her bones, a coldness that transcended the air-conditioned hum of the lab, or the distant bite of the stars. It was a coldness that seeped from the data, from the ancient stone, a silent lament whispering across 250 million years. Her screen glowed, a window not just into time, but into a dying world, long before its final, sudden stop. What she saw now, what she tirelessly sought to reconstruct from isotope ratios and fossilized pollen, was not the 4-hour cataclysm itself, but the long drawn-out sigh that preceded it. The Earth, then, had not merely succumbed in an instant. It had first, very slowly, begun to falter. Like a magnificent beast, once vibrant and teeming, that starts to breathe a little shallower, its coat dulling, its stride losing its confident rhythm. The earliest signs were often the most heartbreakingly subtle, discernible, only to the patient gaze of deep-time science. It began with the air itself, a shift in its very constitution. For millions of years, the world had basked in an atmosphere rich and life-giving, its breath deep and steady. But then, an almost imperceptible thickening, a minute alteration in the dance of carbon and oxygen. Perhaps it was a whisper of volcanic exhalations from distant, brooding rifts, not the thunderous cataclysm that some theories propose for the later, more dramatic collapses, but a constant, low murmur of release, like a slow leak from a vast, unseen reservoir. This gentle poisoning, over millennia, began to shift the delicate planetary balance. The oceans, those ancient cradles of life, were the first to truly taste the change. Evelyn saw it in the fossilized remnants of ancient shells, their growth patterns stunted, their structures subtly malformed. The water, once a balanced elixir, began to subtly acidify, turning sharp at the edges. Not a sudden corrosive bite, but a slow creeping burn that stole calcium from the very fabric of marine life. Plankton, the invisible bedrock of the food chain, felt it first. Their numbers, once kaleidoscopic and boundless, began to thin, leaving ever-widening gaps in the ocean's tapestry. The great, ancient reefs, built by generations of patient corals, seemed to hesitate, their vibrant growth slowing, their colors dimming, becoming fragile echoes of their former glory. On land, the green heart of the world began to beat erratically. The mighty forests of giant ferns and ancient conifers, which had stood sentinel for eons, started to recede at their edges. The soil, once rich and generous, grew weary, its nutrients slowly leaching away, leaving behind a more barren, less forgiving embrace. Rain patterns, once predictable cycles that nourished vast ecosystems, grew erratic. Longer droughts in some regions, unexpected deluges in others, creating a cruel paradox of thirst and flood. Rivers, once mighty arteries, sometimes dwindled to sluggish trickles, leaving behind cracked, sun-baked riverbeds that told silent tales of once thriving aquatic life. Life itself, with its eternal tenacity, struggled to adapt. Evelyn saw the story in the fossilized bones, not of mass extinction yet, but of increasing stress. The amphibians, once lords of the humid swamps, found their damp havens shrinking, their skin drying, their progeny facing harsher odds. Early reptiles, adaptable and resilient, found their foraging grounds less abundant, their energy levels lower. She imagined them, these creatures of a distant past, their ancient instincts nudging them towards dwindler holes, towards sun-scorched patches of earth where only tough, resilient weeds now clung. The air they breathed felt heavier. The sunlight, though still bright, seemed to carry an almost imperceptible weight of warning. The subtle signs began to accumulate, like grains of sand in an hourglass that would soon empty. The gradual yellowing of once verdant leaves, the shrinking of ancient swamps, the faint sheen on stagnant water that hinted at unseen chemical changes. Animal populations, once robust, showed signs of genetic bottlenecking, a whispered warning of dwindling diversity. They were not dying in droves, not yet, but they were breathing harder, living on the precarious edge of a world that was slowly but surely closing in around them. It was a slow, agonizing process, this planetary decline, a prelude to the unimaginable. The sheer scale of it, millions of years, made it almost impossible for a human mind to truly grasp. Yet Evelyn felt it acutely, a low thrum of sorrow vibrating through her. She understood that this drawn-out deterioration, this slow succumbing, was perhaps even more poignant than the final swift death. For in those long eons, life had clung, had fought, had adapted, hoping against hope that the gentle warming, the shifting rains, the subtle changes in the air were just another of Earth's moods. They could not have known they were the opening chords of a dirge played across an entire planet, preparing for a silence that would fall, not gradually, but in 4 impossible hours. The knowledge settled around Evelyn like the cool Arizona dust, thick and ancient. It was a testament to the planet's resilience, but also to its ultimate fragility. The Earth had been giving subtle warnings, faint tremors, for millions of years before its final, silent gasp. And understanding this drawn-out agony, Evelyn knew, was key to comprehending the chilling suddenness of the end. It wasn't just a world that froze. It was a world that was already, quietly dying. Oh, the 4-hour stillness. Dr. Evelyn Reed knew the language of deep time. She knew the slow, patient unfolding of epochs, the stately dance of continents, the glacial creep of climate shifts. To witness, through the cold lens of data, a planet's sudden, wrenching cessation was to confront a silence so profound it echoed across the eons. It was the question of those 4 hours, 250 million years ago, that haunted her, a whisper in the quiet hum of her Arizona lab. She would lean back, eyes unfocused from the holographic displays that rendered ancient Earth in vibrant hues, and try to inhabit that moment, not with the detached analysis of a scientist, but with the empathetic imagination of an anthropologist trying to understand a lost civilization's final breath. What did it feel like for a world to stop? He envisioned a morning like any other, 250 million years ago. Sunlight dappling through the fern forests, the murmur of the proto-amphibians in the warm swamps, the slow drift of clouds over the vast supercontinent of Pangaea. Life, vibrant and tenacious, moving in its ancient rhythms. Then, the rupture. Not a slow dimming, but a switch thrown, a cosmic lever pulled. Perhaps it began subtly, an inexplicable chill on the morning breeze, a shiver that rippled through the air, deeper than any approaching storm. The first sign, Evelyn speculated, might have been atmospheric, a sudden, catastrophic drop in pressure, not from a vacuum, but from an immense, instantaneous expansion of something previously contained. Was it a global outgassing of cryogenic reservoirs, deep within the mantle, suddenly unlocked by an unimaginable seismic event? A vast, planet-spanning fissure that opened, not to molten rock, but to a liquid darkness colder than anything known to surface dwellers, rushing upwards. She imagined the air growing heavy, then thin, the very breath being drawn from lungs as the temperature plummeted. Not a gradual descent, but a plunge. The lush vegetation, accustomed to warmth, would have stiffened, chlorophyll-rich leaves brittle in seconds, snapping under their own weight. The vibrant greens would have dulled, then faded, overtaken by the insidious creep of frost. In her mind's eye, Evelyn saw the oceans. The vast, restless Tethys, the silent Panthalassa. They would have boiled, not with heat, but with the sudden, violent effervescence of gases escaping, then frozen over with impossible speed. Not just the surface, but the column of water itself, solidifying, like a glassblower's breath turning liquid into statue. The currents, the waves, the myriad life within, fish, mollusks, ancient cephalopods, caught in mid-swim, mid-drift, suspended in an instant mausoleum of ice. The very sounds of the sea, the lapping, the crashing, would have simply ceased, swallowed by the expanding silence. On land, the creatures, whatever their form, would have felt it first as an unbearable ache in their bones, then a paralysis. A sudden, agonizing halt to every biological function. Lungs no longer drawing air, hearts no longer beating, cells no longer exchanging. Not a slow death by suffocation or starvation, but an immediate global arrest. Evelyn pictured an ancient reptile, mid-stride, perhaps reaching for a juicy fern, its muscles locking, its eyes wide, reflecting a world turning instantly to crystal. The very water in its blood, its cells, flash frozen, expanding, tearing. 4 hours. It was a cruel measure of time. Long enough for awareness, perhaps, of the terror, of the incomprehensible shift in reality. Long enough for a planet, alive with sound and motion, to become a massive, silent tomb. Imagine the wind, once rustling through primeval trees, now still, its very substance perhaps condensing into icy mists that swirled low over the rapidly freezing landscape. Clouds, once fluffy white, becoming dark, heavy shrouds of ice crystals, shedding a dust of frozen air onto an already dying world. It wasn't just cold. It was the cessation of all kinetic energy, a cosmic deep freeze that went beyond mere temperature. It implied a removal of heat yin on a scale that defied the known laws of planetary physics, or an internal reorganization so profound it radiated coldness outwards. The Earth, in those 4 hours, became a perfect thermodynamic sink, drawing warmth into an abyss that offered no return. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the image settle. A world shrouded in instant permafrost. Oceans turned to solid glass. Atmosphere condensed into a frozen shroud. The very tectonic plates, those slow-moving giants, might have shuddered, then locked, their ancient groans muffled by the sudden, profound stillness. It was a planetary gasp, followed by an eternal silence. A silence not merely of sound, but of motion, of life, of possibility. Question of why in those specific 4 hours? Why such an impossible speed remained the hollow echo in the bedrock. But the Yahweh, the violent, silent, devastating cessation of everything, haunted Evelyn Reed with the somber weight of an ancient, planetary lament. What was left was a world encased in a profound, devastating stillness, a petrified echo of a vibrant past, waiting for 250 million years to whisper its frozen secret to a lone scientist in an Arizona desert. The long, silent winter. The world, in those moments, ceased to spin in its accustomed rhythm. It didn't merely slow, it entered a terrifying stasis. From the deepest ocean trench to the highest mountain peak, A singular, unbroken sheet of ice now held sway. Where ancient oceans had once churned with the exuberance of life, cephalopods darting through coral cities, colossal fish patrolling the sun-dappled depths, now lay a solid, impermeable mass. It was as if a cosmic hand had reached down, and with chilling precision, pressed pause on the planet's vital functions. The atmosphere, once a breathable, life-sustaining blanket, seemed to thicken, its moisture locked away, its current stilled into a permanent, frigid embrace. Above the vast, featureless plains of ice, the sky was a bruised, silent canvas. The sun, though still a distant star, offered only a sterile, indifferent light that reflected off the crystalline surface, creating an illusion of vastness devoid of warmth. There was no sound of wind soughing through unseen trees, for the forests that had once painted continents in shades of green and gold were now brittle, frozen skeletal remains, often entombed within the advancing glacial front. There was no ripple of water, no chirping of insects, no distant roar of a predator or the gentle rustle of prey. Just an immense suffocating silence, the kind that presses in on the ears, a vacuum of all noise, a testament to the instantaneous cessation of countless biological processes. This was the earth in its stillness. Not the quiet repose of winter, which promises spring, but the profound, unyielding silence of death, devoid of the very promise of revival. Geological time, often measured in increments too vast for the human mind to grasp, had here been compressed into an unthinkably brief flicker. 4 hours. A blink. And the vibrant tapestry of life, woven over hundreds of millions of years, had been shredded, leaving only the bare threads of a world suspended in a cryogenic nightmare. Life, that tenacious, astonishing force, had been almost entirely extinguished. The grand, sprawling ecosystems that had thrived just moments before were now museums of ice. A lone fern, caught mid-photosynthesis, encased in a block of blue ice, its delicate fronds perfectly preserved in their final pose. A school of fish, mid-turn, solidified into a glass-like sculpture. Here and there, perhaps, in the deep geothermal vents of the ocean floor, or within the crushing pressures of the planet's crust, isolated pockets of extremophile bacteria might have clung to existence, microscopic embers against an inferno of cold. But on the vast surface, across the sprawling landmasses that would one day become the Americas, Europe, Asia, there was nothing. A biological desert on a scale unfathomable. A desolation, so absolute it bordered on the sublime. The very air seemed to hold a memory of what was lost, a faint, melancholic echo of the billions upon billions of breaths that had suddenly ceased. For a species like humanity, looking back across the chasm of time, this epoch represented a universal grief. Not just the sorrow for individual lives extinguished, the dinosaurs yet to roam, the mammals yet to evolve, the intricate dance of flora and fauna, the very emergence of consciousness itself, but a lament for the grand narrative interrupted. A story of evolution, diversification, and adaptation, so meticulously written over eons, had been abruptly, brutally redacted. Dr. Reed, contemplating these impossible data points from her Arizona desert lab, understood this grief intuitively. It wasn't merely academic. It was the poignant understanding of life's precariousness, of how even a world teeming with robust, complex organisms could be rendered null in the time it takes for a sunset. The frozen Earth of 250 million years ago wasn't just a geological curiosity. It was a cautionary tale whispered across the eons, a stark reminder that existence, in its grandest forms, is often sustained by an invisible, fragile thread. The silence of that ancient world permeated even the modern understanding of it. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a stillness that held an active, terrifying power. It was the silence of a stopped heart, a frozen river. A world that had, for all intents and purposes, held its breath and never exhaled. The philosophical weight of it pressed down, not just on the scientific inquiry into how it had happened, but what it meant. What does it mean for a planet to suffer such an existential cataclysm? What does it say about the true nature of time, which can both meticulously build and instantaneously dismantle? In the imagined landscape of that frozen Permian world, one could almost feel the phantom chill, the pervasive emptiness. There was no sign of the vibrant, sun-drenched beauty that had defined it just moments before. No rustling leaves, no buzzing insects, no cries of birds or the scurry of small creatures. Just the smooth, unbroken expanse of ice, stretching to the horizon, reflecting the indifferent light of a distant sun. It was a world made perfect, in its own terrible way, a crystalline monument to a profound and sudden absence. And in that desolate perfection lay the true horror, a testament to the unimaginable power of a force that could silence an entire planet, leaving behind only the echo of a forgotten song. The search for wine was not just a scientific pursuit. It was an elegy for a world that had, for a brief terrifying interval, forgotten how to live. In whispers of green in a white world, the silence that followed the planet's sudden, impossible breathlessness had been vast. A cosmic void pressed against a frozen world. For eons it remained, a monument to a grief too immense for sound. Dr. Evelyn Reed, her mind often wandering through those unimaginable epochs, sometimes felt the lingering chill of it, even in the warmth of her Arizona lab. She understood, with a scientist's detached empathy, that death on such a scale was not an ending, but a profound recalibration, a turning point in the cosmic accounting ledger. But the true mystery was not the death, but the quiet, tenacious, almost defiant whisper of life that eventually, against all odds, began to stir in the frozen depths. The thaw, when it finally began, was as agonizingly slow as the freeze had been terrifyingly swift. Millennia bled into millennia. The great ice sheets, like calcified memories of a lost age, began their reluctant retreat. Runoff, initially a trickle, carved nascent channels through barren rock, carrying not just meltwater, but the ghosts of minerals, the faint, persistent chemical signatures of a world yearning to be reborn. In the deepest crevices, where geothermal heat lingered, or beneath the protective blankets of new-formed permafrost, life had not entirely vanished. It had merely retreated, simplified, and waited. The first stirrings were not seen, but sensed, a shift in the isotopic ratios of carbon, trapped in sedimentary layers, a faint, almost immeasurable increase in atmospheric oxygen. The whisper of ancient metabolism restarted. It was the work of the extremophiles, the quiet heroes of deep time. Bacteria and archaea, dormant for millions of years, held within their resilient spores the genetic blueprints for survival. They were the first to unfold, one cell at a time, drawing sustenance from the most meager of offerings, trace elements leached from the rock, the scant warmth from geological shifts, the faint resonance of decaying organic matter from the world that was. Their existence was a testament to a truth deeper than any catastrophe. Life, in its fundamental essence, simply wash. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the colors began to return to a world bleached to grayscale. First, the muted greens and purples of microbial mats clinging to the damp surfaces of newly exposed rock, photosynthesizing under a sun that now seemed too bright for a world that had forgotten its warmth. These were not the lush, vibrant ecosystems of old, but fragile, tenacious veneers of life, each cell a tiny, unyielding engine of existence. They secreted compounds that slowly, patiently, began to break down the rock, laying the groundwork for future soils that would take millions more years to form. It was a laborious, whispered conversation between life and lithosphere, a slow, geological sigh of relief. As these pioneering microbial communities expanded, they created niches. Small, simple organisms, perhaps microscopic nematodes or tardigrades that had endured the freeze, began to graze on the mats. Their lives were short, brutally hard, but each cycle of birth and death contributed to the slow accumulation of organic matter, building the nascent ecosystems from the ground up. This was not the grand roaring tapestry of biodiversity that had existed before. It was a patchwork, a quilt of resilience woven from the thinnest threads. Each new species that emerged, each new adaptation, was a small miracle, a quiet defiance against the immense destruction that had preceded it. They were leaner, hardier, their genetic codes pruned by the brutal selectivity of the ice, bearing the scars of the catastrophe in their very being. Evolution, in this post-apocalyptic landscape, was not a stately march, but a frantic, desperate dance. Every mutation, every small genetic advantage, was seized upon and amplified. Life explored every possible pathway, every available resource, with an urgency born of planetary trauma. New forms emerged, specialized for survival in a world still raw and unpredictable. Perhaps a lineage of fungi that could break down the most intractable of ancient lignin, or a novel strain of archaea that thrived in geothermal vents, their metabolic pathways forever altered by the crucible of catastrophe. Dr. Reed often thought of these unseen organisms, these ghost lineages of a world reborn, as the truest poets of persistence. They did not sing, they simply were, and in their being, they wrote the next chapter of existence. This was life's persistent will, a quiet, inexorable force that transcended individual organisms, species, or even epochs. It was the universe's most profound answer to annihilation. A slow, gentle hum of resurgence. It spoke not of triumph or conquest, but of endurance, of the quiet strength found in fragility. The world, once a frozen echo, was learning to breathe again, not with the full, vibrant exhalation of its past, but with a series of tentative, hopeful sighs. And in those sighs, stretching across millions of years, lay the profound, almost sorrowful beauty of existence itself, always reaching, always adapting, always whispering its tenacious claim to life, even from the deepest, coldest shadows of time. Evelyn could almost hear it, a faint, ancient melody, hummed in the very bedrock beneath her feet. The echo across epochs. The hum of the lab's cooling systems was a familiar lullaby, a counterpoint to the profound silence that often settled over the Arizona desert after midnight. Dr. Evelyn Reed leaned back in her chair, the glow of the data screens casting an ethereal light across her face. Outside, the vast, inky expanse of the sky was a tapestry of ancient stars, each a pinprick of light that had traveled for millennia to reach her eyes. Here, in this quiet sanctuary of science, the immensity of time felt not abstract, but palpable, a heavy cloak she wore over her shoulders. She had just reviewed the latest iterations of the freeze data, a tapestry woven from fossil records, isotopic ratios, and geological signatures, each thread pointing to the same impossible conclusion. A planet-wide stillness. A cosmic pause, button pressed with devastating speed. 4 hours. That was the most chilling detail, the brutal brevity of the transition from vibrant life to frozen tomb. 250 million years ago, a living world, breathing and teeming, had simply stopped. And then, the quiet, almost sorrowful question would inevitably rise in her mind, like a phantom limb ache. What about us? Wherein? Humanity, so full of bluster and brilliance, so convinced of its own mastery over its domain. We carve out cities from mountain seeds, redirect rivers, pierce the very atmosphere with our towering monuments to ingenuity. We measure our progress in centuries, in decades, in the swift pulse of an internet connection. Our history, a frantic, glorious dash across a mere sliver of time, seems so utterly robust, so undeniably significant. Yet, the deep time of Earth, the languid dance of continents, the slow, inexorable churn of the planet's heart, whispered a different truth. Our achievements, so painstakingly built, so fiercely defended, felt utterly ephemeral against the backdrop of such cataclysmic shifts. The grandest empires crumbled into dust, their stones reclaimed by the patient earth. Our digital legacies, so meticulously stored in vast humming servers, were but a breath compared to the eons it took for a mountain range to rise and fall. Evelyn thought of the bustling metropolises, the intricate networks of human connection, the constant hum of ambition and fear that defined our waking lives. What would 4 hours look like for Klaus? A blink, a cough, a sudden, uncomprehending silence. The thought wasn't born of cynicism, but of a profound, almost aching humility. We walk on a planet that has endured extinctions, global freezes, and volcanic eruptions on scales that dwarf our wildest nightmares. We build our homes on its skin, extract its resources, gaze at its beauty, often forgetting that it is not merely a stage for our drama, but an active, living entity with its own colossal rhythms. The ancient freeze wasn't an act of malice, but perhaps a stark reminder of Earth's indifference, its cosmic neutrality. It simply was sane, and in its being, it could extinguish life with a swiftness that defied human comprehension, leaving behind only a petrified whisper in the rock. Our anxieties, too, seemed to shrink in this immense reflection. The daily headlines, the political squabbles, the economic anxieties that gnawed at the edges of our collective consciousness. They were real, they mattered to human lives. But viewed through the geological lens, they became fleeting concerns, ripples on an oceanic surface that had seen tsunamis of cosmic proportions. It wasn't to diminish our struggles, Evelyn mused, but to offer a different kind of perspective. Calming, if mournful, realization that we are but a fleeting moment in a vast, ongoing narrative. And in that vastness, there was a quiet plea for understanding, for reverence. The ancient world had not seen it coming. Or perhaps the signs were there, dismissed, unread. The why of the ancient freeze remained the most elusive secret, a silent accusation echoing through the eons. Was it an asteroid, a supervolcano, a solar flare, or something far more subtle and insidious, a slow sickness that culminated in a sudden, violent fever? The data, as revealing as it was, still held its tongue on the ultimate trigger. And in that unknowing lay a chilling parallel. Were we too missing the whispers? The groans of the continental plates, the faint hum of ancient atoms, the subtle shifts in our own climate. Or were we simply too preoccupied with our own fleeting triumphs to truly listen? Evelyn traced the glowing lines on the screen, the remnants of a vanished world. The desert night beyond the window offered no answers, only an infinite, silent expanse. The profound implications of that ancient sudden stop were not about predicting doom, but about understanding fragility. Not just the fragility of life, but the fragility of perception, of our human-centric view of a universe that cared little for our timeline. It was a call to listen more deeply, to tread more lightly, to remember that the Earth had been here long before us, and in all likelihood would be here long after. And sometimes, in its quiet, unimaginable power, it could simply, suddenly, hold its breath. A pebble in the river of time. The quiet had settled, not just in the lab after the last hum of machinery faded, but within Dr. Evelyn Reed herself. It was a silence deeper than the absence of sound, a resonant void filled only by the slow, steady beat of her own heart, and, she imagined, the distant pulse of the planet beneath her. The Arizona night, usually a canvas for bright, impatient stars, now seemed a vast, understanding presence, echoing the stillness that had permeated the Earth 250 million years ago. For weeks, months, perhaps even years, the 4-hour freeze had been a jagged shard in her mind, a defiance of all logic, a grotesque interruption in the gentle rhythm of geological time. Her initial pursuit had been fierce, almost violent in its intensity, to dissect, to explain, to force this anomaly into the neat boxes of scientific understanding. But the deeper she delved, the more the data whispered back, not answers, but deeper questions, not solutions, but a profound, unyielding truth. Now, sitting by the window, the faint scent of creosote bush carried on the sparse desert air, Evelyn felt a new kind of calm wash over her. It wasn't the calm of resolution, of having solved the impossible riddle. No, it was the quiet, melancholic understanding that the riddle wasn't meant to be solved in the way she'd originally conceived. It was meant to be absorbed, to be felt, to be grieved for, and then, ultimately, to be accepted. The Earth's long history, she realized with a soft sigh that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the dim lab light, wasn't a linear progression towards an inevitable future. It was a vast, intricate tapestry woven from threads of profound change, punctuated by cataclysmic loss, and eternally renewed by the miracle of rebirth. 4-hour freeze, once a horrifying singularity, now seemed to find its place, albeit a stark and unique one, within this grand cyclical narrative. She thought of the countless mass extinctions that predated humanity, the Permian Triassic being the most devastating, of which this frozen instant was a chilling, amplified whisper. Entire families of life, thriving for eons, vanished in the blink of a geological eye, their diverse forms reduced to fossilized murmurs in the rock. Rivers of time, teeming with vibrant life, suddenly choked, then lay still, only for new currents to eventually carve new paths, carrying new, resilient forms of life forward. It was a relentless, beautiful, and heartbreaking dance. There is a particular sadness in this understanding, a quiet grief for the uncountable lives that perished, for the vibrant ecosystems that were obliterated in an instant. It was a grief not just for the ancient Earth, but for the inherent fragility of all existence, including her own. Life, in its exuberant diversity, was also profoundly vulnerable. And yet, this vulnerability was twinned with an astonishing tenacity. To lose so much, and yet for life, in its myriad forms, to persist, to reinvent, to proliferate again. It was a testament that transcended mere biology. It was an enduring universal principle. Evelyn traced the condensation on the cool glass, the patterns shifting like ephemeral landscapes. Her own life, her own scientific pursuit, suddenly seemed a delicate, infinitesimal tremor within this cosmic symphony. She had spent her career trying to decipher the Earth's past, to map its contours, to understand its processes. But now, she understood that she was not merely an observer, a detached analyst. She was a part of it, a fleeting consciousness peering back through immense time, a brief, fragile link in a chain that stretched back to the first stirrings of life and forward into an unknowable future. This realization brought with it a profound sense of humility, a shedding of the ego that often accompanied grand scientific quests. What was her intellect, her intricate models, her cutting-edge technology in the face of such unfathomable forces? They were tools, yes, but the true wisdom lay not in mastery, but in quiet reverence. To stand before such immense time, such overwhelming power, and to simply listen, that was the greater achievement. Gold screen on her desk, once a window into her obsession, now felt like a mirror reflecting the ancient whisper of resilience. The earth had frozen, yes, in a way that defied comprehension. But it had not died. Life had found a way to endure, to adapt, to blossom again, taking millions of years to reclaim its vibrant mantle. The silence of those 4 hours was not an end, but a punctuation mark, a breath held before the next grand exhalation. And she, Evelyn Reed, was now a carrier of that whisper. It wasn't a scientific hypothesis to be proven, but an ancient truth to be felt and lived. Her role wasn't to prevent another freeze, for such power was beyond human grasp. Her role, perhaps, was simply to remember the fragility, to remember the tenacity, to remember that the grand, intricate dance of life, loss, and rebirth continued, regardless of human presence or understanding. As the pre-dawn glow began to paint the distant saguaros with soft hues of violet and rose, Evelyn stood up, stretching muscles stiff from hours of contemplation. The desert outside was waking, not with a roar, but with a gentle stirring, a subtle shift in the light and temperature. It was a familiar awakening, yet today it felt imbued with a deeper meaning. She was part of this cycle too, a brief, aware moment within an eternity. And carrying that quiet, ancient whisper within her, she knew, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.